The tomato struck Clara's cheek with a wet splat, its crimson juice mingling with the tears she refused to shed. The crowd in Millbrook's town square erupted in jeers and laughter, their voices echoing off the weathered storefronts like a pack of hungry wolves. She stood perfectly still, her chin lifted in defiance, even as another piece of rotten fruit sailed past her ear. "Murderer!" shouted Mrs. Henderson, her face twisted with rage. "You killed my boy as sure as if you'd put a gun to his head." Clara's hands trembled at her sides, but she didn't move. She couldn't move. Not when the whole town had gathered to witness her shame, not when the sheriff stood by doing nothing, not when the preacher himself had turned his back on her. 3 weeks had passed since the accident. 3 weeks since Tommy Henderson had died in that terrible collision on the rain-slicked road outside town. 3 weeks since her world had crumbled into dust and ashdot. The crowd pressed closer, their anger palpable in the humid afternoon air. Someone threw a stone that grazed her shoulder, and Clara bit her lip to keep from crying out. She'd known this day would come. The whispers had been growing louder, the stares more hostile. The unofficial trial had already taken place in the minds of Millbrook's citizens, and she'd been found guilty without ever having her say. She was drinking. Someone yelled from the back. "Everyone knows it. Driving like a maniac in the rain. Should be in jail." Clara closed her eyes, remembering that night with crystalline clarity. The rain hammering her windshield, the headlights appearing suddenly around the bend, the sickening crunch of metal and glass. She'd been stone sober, driving carefully, but Tommy had been speeding, taking that curve too fast like he always did. The sheriff's report had cleared her of wrongdoing, but facts meant nothing to a grieving mother and a town hungry for someone to blame. A shadow fell across her face, and she opened her eyes to find herself looking at a pair of scuffed leather boots. Her gaze traveled upward, taking in worn denim, a simple plaid shirt, and finally a weathered face beneath a black cowboy hat. She'd never seen him before, but something about his presence made the crowd's shouting seem distant, muffled. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, his broad shoulders creating a barrier between her and the mob. His blue eyes were calm, steady, and when he looked at her, she saw no judgment, no condemnation, just quiet understanding. The crowd's fury faltered, confusion rippling through their ranks. Who was this stranger? Why was he protecting her? Mrs. Henderson's voice rose above the murmurs, shrill and desperate. "Get away from her. She doesn't deserve your pity." But the cowboy remained motionless, his silence more powerful than any words. Clara found herself breathing easier for the first time in weeks, protected by this unexpected guardian angel who'd appeared out of nowhere. She didn't know his name, didn't know why he'd chosen to stand with her. But in that moment, she felt something she'd thought was lost forever: hope. The afternoon sun caught the silver buckle of his belt, and Clara realized that sometimes salvation came not with fanfare or proclamation, but in the quiet courage of a stranger willing to stand in the storm. The cowboy's presence seemed to draw the venom from the crowd's anger, like a snake charmer mesmerizing a pit of vipers. Clara watched in amazement as the hostile faces around them grew uncertain, their raised fists slowly lowering. The man beside her hadn't moved an inch, hadn't spoken a word, but his calm authority was undeniable. "Who are you?" Mrs. Henderson demanded, her voice cracking with grief and rage. "This is none of your business." The cowboy tilted his hat slightly, acknowledging her pain without yielding ground. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Ma'am, I was driving behind them that night." The square fell silent. Even the birds seemed to stop singing, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at this man who'd just changed everything with 7 simple words. "That's impossible." Sheriff Martinez stepped forward, his hand resting on his holster. "We interviewed every witness. Was hauling cattle to the Morrison Ranch," the cowboy continued, his eyes never leaving Mrs. Henderson's face. "Been meaning to come forward, but I wanted to make sure I had my facts straight. Your boy was doing 60 in a 35 zone. The lady here was driving proper careful, even had her hazards on account of the rain." Mrs. Henderson's face went white as parchment. "You're lying. You're just protecting her. Because what?" The cowboy's voice remained gentle, but there was steel beneath the velvet. "Because I got no reason to lie to a grieving mother. Because I got nothing to gain by telling the truth except doing what's right." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small device Clara recognized as a dashboard camera. "Got it all recorded right here. The insurance company's already got a copy, but I figured you folks deserved to hear it from me first." The crowd began to murmur, uncertainty replacing their earlier bloodlust. Clara felt her knees go weak with relief and disbelief. Someone had seen, someone knew the truth. She'd been carrying the weight of an entire town's condemnation, and now this stranger was lifting it from her shoulders. "I don't believe you," Mrs. Henderson whispered. But her voice lacked conviction. The cowboy's expression softened with genuine compassion. "Ma'am, I got a boy of my own. If something happened to him, I'd want someone to blame too. But destroying an innocent woman won't bring Tommy back. It'll just create more pain in a world that's already got too much." Sheriff Martinez stepped forward, his earlier hostility replaced by professional interest. "I'll need to see that footage, of course." The cowboy handed over the device. "Name's Jake Morrison. Been working my family's ranch about 20 miles north of here. You can verify everything I'm telling you." Clara found her voice at last, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Jake turned to her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her pulse quicken. "Sometimes it takes a while to find the courage to do what's right. I saw what this town was doing to you, and I couldn't stand by any longer." The crowd was dispersing now, shame replacing their earlier righteous anger. Some looked back at Clara with apologetic glances, while others simply hurried away, unable to face what they'd almost done. Mrs. Henderson stood frozen in the center of the square, her world crumbling around her as surely as Clara's had 3 weeks ago. "I'm sorry," Clara said to her, the words carrying all the pain and understanding of someone who'd walked through hell. "I'm so sorry about Tommy." Mrs. Henderson looked at her with eyes full of tears and the terrible realization of what she'd almost done. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Jake tipped his hat to Clara, and she caught a glimpse of something that made her heart skip. The promise of a future she'd thought was lost forever. Clara's hands shook as she unlocked her front door. The events of the afternoon still crashing over her like ocean waves. She'd barely made it inside before her knees gave out, and she sank onto her living room floor, finally allowing the tears she'd held back to fall freely. The house felt different now, less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. For 3 weeks, she'd been afraid to venture out, afraid to face the hostile stares and whispered accusations. Her teaching job at the elementary school had been suspended pending investigation, though everyone knew it was really because parents didn't want a killer around their children. A soft knock at her door made her heart race. Through the peephole, she saw Jake Morrison standing on her porch, his hat in his hands, looking uncertain for the first time since she'd met him. "Miss Clara, I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to make sure you are all right." She opened the door, acutely aware of her tear-stained face and trembling hands. "I don't even know how to thank you. What you did today, ... Mind if I come in? There's more we need to talk about." Clara nodded, stepping aside to let him into her modest living room. He moved carefully, as if afraid his presence might overwhelm the delicate china and lace doilies that had belonged to her grandmother. When he sat on her sofa, he looked comically large, like a giant in a dollhouse. "You saved my life today," Clara said, settling into the chair across from him. "I don't understand why. You don't even know me." Jake was quiet for a long moment, turning his hat in his hands. "I know more than you think. I know you've been teaching 3rd grade for 8 years. I know you volunteer at the animal shelter every weekend. I know you brought soup to old Mr. Peterson when he was sick last winter, and you've been quietly paying for the Williams family's groceries since Jim lost his job." Clara stared at him in shock. How could you possibly know all that? Small town, people talk, and before today, they talked about you with respect. You're not just a good person, Clara. You're the kind of person who makes the world a little brighter, just by being in it. The way he said her name made something warm unfurl in her chest. "You called me Miss Clara before. How did you know my name?" Jake's cheeks colored slightly. "I've been wanting to introduce myself for months. I come into town every few weeks, for supplies, and I always seem to catch glimpses of you. At the grocery store, the post office, walking down Main Street. You have this way of moving through the world that's graceful, kind. I kept meaning to work up the courage to say hello, but you never did. No, I never did. I'm better with cattle than I am with people, especially people like you." Clara felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in years. People like me. Beautiful, educated, refined. I'm just a rancher. Clara, I get up before dawn, work with my hands, and go to bed smelling like hay and horses. What would someone like you want with someone like me? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Clara studied his face, taking in the honest brown eyes. the weathered skin that spoke of years under the sun, the strong hands that had built a life from nothing but hard work and determination. Maybe, she said softly, you're exactly what someone like me needs. Jake's breath caught, and Clara saw hope bloom in his expression. I want to know you, Clara, the real you, not the version this town tried to destroy today, but the woman who teaches children to read, who rescues stray cats, who stands up to a mob with her head held high. I'd like that, Clara whispered, feeling as if she was stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. But I should warn you, I'm not the same person I was before the accident. I may never be again. Neither am I, Jake said, leaning forward. Watching what they did to you today changed something in me. Made me realize that life's too short to spend it on the sidelines, watching other people live. Outside, the sun was setting, painting Clara's living room in shades of gold and amber. For the first time in 3 weeks, she felt like she could breathe again. The future, which had seemed so dark and uncertain that morning, now held the promise of something beautiful. Would you like to stay for dinner? She asked, surprised by her own boldness. Jake's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. I'd like that very much. The kitchen filled with the aroma of Clara's famous pot roast, a recipe passed down through 3 generations of women who'd learned to find comfort in the simple act of feeding others. Jake sat at a small dining table, looking slightly out of place among the delicate china and embroidered placemats, but somehow perfectly right. I haven't cooked for anyone in weeks, Clara admitted, stirring the gravy with more attention than it required. I'd forgotten how nice it is to have company. I haven't had a home-cooked meal in months, Jake replied, watching her move around the kitchen with quiet appreciation. My usual dinner consists of whatever I can heat up in the microwave after the day's work is done. Clara turned to study him, noting the way his shirt pulled across his broad shoulders, the calluses on his hands that spoke of honest labor. Tell me about your ranch. Jake's face lit up in a way that transformed his rugged features. It's not much to look at yet, but it's mine. 300 acres of the prettiest land you ever saw, rolling hills and a creek that runs clear even in the dry season. I've got about 50 head of cattle now, hoping to expand to 100 by next year. That sounds like a lot of work for one person. It is, but it's the kind of work that makes you feel alive. You know, every sunrise is different. Every season brings new challenges. There's something about working the land that connects you to something bigger than yourself. Clara served the meal, and they ate in companionable silence, the weight of the days, events settling between them, like a bridge they were both learning to cross. Outside, the evening sounds of the small town drifted through the open windows, children playing in distant yards, the murmur of neighbors talking over fences, the gentle hum of life continuing despite the drama that had unfolded in the town square. Can I ask you something? Jake said, setting down his fork. What's it been like these past 3 weeks? Really like? Clara's hand stilled on her water glass. No one had asked her that question, not with genuine concern. Lonely, she said finally. Frightening. Like living in a glass house where everyone can see in but no one wants to come close enough to really look. I can't imagine what that must have felt like. The worst part wasn't the accusations or the stares. It was the silence from people I thought were friends, my teaching colleagues, my neighbors, even the clerk at the grocery store who'd chatted with me for years. They all just disappeared. Jake reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His palm was warm, slightly rough from honest work, and incredibly gentle. You don't have to face that silence alone anymore. Clara looked down at their joined hands, marveling at how such a simple gesture could feel so profound. Why are you doing this? Really? A man like you could have any woman in 3 counties. A man like me. Jake's laugh was soft and self-deprecating. Clara, I'm 34 years old, and I've never been married. You know why? Because I've never met anyone who made me want to be a better man than I already am. Until today. Today you barely know me. I know enough. I know you stood in that square and took everything they threw at you without breaking. I know you didn't curse them or fight back or try to justify yourself. You just stood there with dignity intact. And that tells me more about your character than 1,000 conversations could. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, but these were different from the ones she'd shed earlier. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of something that might have been hope. I'm scared, she admitted. I'm scared to trust this, to trust you, to trust that things might actually be okay again. Jake squeezed her hand gently. I'm scared too, but maybe being scared together is better than being scared alone. As if summoned by their conversation, a soft knock came at the door. Clara tensed, her earlier fear returning, but Jake squeezed her hand reassuringly. "I'll get it," he said, rising from the table. Through the doorway, Clara could hear a woman's voice, hesitant and apologetic. "I'm looking for Clara Whitmore. I'm Sarah Martinez, the sheriff's wife. I need to apologize." Clara's heart began to race as she recognized the voice of someone who'd been particularly vocal in her condemnation. But Jake's presence gave her courage, and she rose to face whatever came next. Sarah Martinez stood on Clara's porch, wringing her hands like a penitent child. Her usually perfect hair was disheveled, her eyes red from crying, and she looked as if she'd aged 10 years in the span of an afternoon. "Clara, I don't know how to begin," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What I did, what I said, there's no excuse for it." Clara stepped aside, allowing Sarah to enter her living room. Jake remained close, his presence a comforting anchor in the storm of emotions swirling around them. "I led the charge against you," Sarah continued, her voice cracking. "I convinced half the town that you were guilty before any of us knew the facts. I was so angry, so ready to blame someone, that I didn't stop to think about what I was doing to an innocent person." "Why?" Clara asked, the question that had haunted her for weeks finally finding voice. "Why were you so certain I was guilty?" Sarah sank into the chair Clara offered, her shoulders shaking. "Because my own son was in a car accident 2 years ago. He was driving drunk, crashed into a tree, and spent 3 months in the hospital. I know how it feels to get that phone call, to stand in a hospital room and wonder if your child is going to live or die." Clara felt the anger she'd carried for weeks begin to dissolve, replaced by understanding. "Your son survived." "He did. But Mrs. Henderson's didn't. And I think I transferred all my fear and anger onto you. It was easier to hate you than to face the fact that sometimes terrible things just happen, that sometimes there's no one to blame." Jake cleared his throat softly. "Mrs. Martinez, it takes courage to admit when you're wrong. Not everyone in town will be able to do what you're doing right now." Sarah looked up at him gratefully. "You're Jake Morrison. Thank you for what you did today. For having the courage to speak up when the rest of us were too consumed with our own anger to see the truth." "The truth has a way of coming out eventually," Jake said. "I just helped it along a little." Clara studied Sarah's face, seeing genuine remorse and pain. "I forgive you," she said quietly. "I understand why you did what you did, and I forgive you." Sarah burst into tears, her relief palpable. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but thank you. Thank you for being the person you are, even after everything we put you through." "What happens now?" Clara asked. "With the town, I mean. With the school board. I've already called an emergency meeting for tomorrow night," Sarah said, wiping her eyes. "I'm going to tell them what I did, how I influenced their decision to suspend you. I'm going to recommend that you be reinstated immediately, with full pay for the time you've been out." Clara felt a surge of hope so strong it nearly knocked her over. "You'd do that? It's the least I can do. And Clara, I think you'll find that a lot of people are going to be lining up to apologize once word gets out about what really happened." After Sarah left, Clara and Jake sat in the gathering darkness of her living room, neither of them wanting to break the spell of the evening. The events of the day seemed surreal, like something from a movie rather than her actual life. "I can't believe it's over," Clara said, her voice filled with wonder. "This morning I thought my life was ruined forever, and now, now you get to start over." Jake finished. "Clean slate, fresh beginning." "We get to start over," Clara corrected, surprising herself with her boldness. "If you want to, that is." Jake turned to her, his eyes intense in the lamplight. "Clara, I've wanted to know you for months. Today just gave me the excuse I needed to finally introduce myself." "Some introduction." Clara laughed, feeling giddy with relief and possibility. "Most people start with hello, not, I have video evidence that will clear your name." "I'm not most people," Jake said, moving closer to her on the sofa. "And something tells me you're not either." Clara felt her heart racing as he reached up to touch her face, his thumb gently tracing the line of her cheekbone. "I'm not sure who I am anymore. The person I was before the accident feels like a stranger." "Then we'll figure out who you are now," Jake said softly. Together. When he kissed her, it was gentle and careful, like a promise being made and received. Clara felt something inside her chest unfurled like a flower that had been waiting for spring. For the first time in 3 weeks, she felt truly alive. 3 weeks later, Clara stood in front of her third-grade classroom, watching 22 eager faces stare back at her, with the uncomplicated joy that only children possessed. The school board had not only reinstated her, they'd issued a public apology and given her a commendation for her years of dedicated service. "Miss Clara," little Emma Patterson called out, her hand waving enthusiastically. "My mom says you're a hero." Clara smiled, her heart full. "I'm just a teacher, Emma. The same teacher I've always been. But you stood up to all those mean people." Tommy's desk remained empty, a painful reminder of the tragedy that had started it all. But Clara had learned to carry the grief without letting it consume her. Sometimes, children, the bravest thing you can do is simply tell the truth and stand by it, even when it's hard. During her lunch break, Clara found herself looking out the window toward the school parking lot, where Jake's truck was parked. He'd made it a habit to bring her lunch every day, claiming it was on his way to town anyway, though she knew he was making a special trip just for her. "Still can't believe you landed Jake Morrison," her colleague, Beth, said with a grin. "Half the unmarried women in 3 counties have been trying to get his attention for years." "We're just friends," Clara said, though her cheeks colored. "Friends who have lunch together every day. Friends who go to dinner twice a week. Friends who look at each other like they're the only 2 people in the world," Beth teased. "Sure, Clara, just friends." The truth was, Clara wasn't sure what they were. Their relationship had developed in the aftermath of trauma, built on a foundation of shared truth and mutual respect. But was it love? Or was it simply gratitude and proximity? That evening, Jake arrived at her house with a picnic basket and a smile that made her heart skip. "I thought we might eat dinner somewhere different tonight," he said, offering her his arm. "If you're up for a little adventure." Clara let him lead her to his truck, curiosity bubbling inside her. They drove in comfortable silence through the countryside, past fields of wildflowers and rolling hills painted gold by the setting sun. When Jake finally stopped, Clara gasped. They were on a hill overlooking the most beautiful valley she'd ever seen. A creek meandered through the center, reflecting the sky like a silver ribbon. Cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, and the air smelled of grass and freedom. "This is your ranch," Clara breathed, understanding flooding through her. "The heart of it," Jake confirmed, spreading a blanket on the ground. "I wanted you to see it, to understand why I fight so hard for this place." They sat together as the sun set, sharing sandwiches and stories, and Clara felt a peace she hadn't experienced in months. This land was more than just property. It was Jake's dream made manifest, his vision of the future carved out of earth and sky. "It's beautiful," she said, meaning it. "I can see why you love it." "I was hoping you might," Jake said quietly. "Clara, I need to tell you something. What I feel for you, ... It's not just gratitude, or proximity, or any of the other things you might be thinking. It's love. Pure and simple, and terrifying love." Clara's breath caught. "Jake, ... I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other for a few weeks. But I also know that love doesn't follow a schedule or wait for permission. It just is." Clara looked out over the valley, then back at Jake's earnest face. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm scared to trust this feeling, scared to believe that something so good could come from something so terrible." "I'm scared too," Jake said, taking her hand. "But I'm more scared of wasting this chance, of letting fear keep me from the best thing that's ever happened to me." Clara felt tears sliding down her cheeks, but they were tears of joy, of relief, of a heart finally allowing itself to hope again. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I've loved you since the moment you stood beside me in that square." Jake cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "Then we'll figure out the rest together." As he kissed her, under the star-filled sky, Clara felt the last of her walls crumble. She was no longer the broken woman who'd stood alone in the town square. She was someone new, someone stronger, someone ready to embrace the future with both hands and a heart full of love. 6 months later, Clara stood in her kitchen, humming softly as she prepared Sunday dinner. The house no longer felt like a sanctuary. From the world, it had become a home, filled with laughter and love and the quiet contentment of a life well lived. Jake's boots by the door, his coffee cup in the sink, his jacket draped over the back of her chair. These small signs of his presence filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the oven heating her pot roast. "Something smells incredible," Jake said, wrapping his arms around her from behind and pressing a kiss to her neck. His hair was damp from the shower, and he smelled like soap and sunshine. "Your favorite," Clara replied, leaning back into his embrace. "Though I'm not sure why you insist on driving all the way into town every Sunday, when you could just eat at home." "Because," Jake murmured against her ear, "home is wherever you are." Clara's heart fluttered at his words. as it had every day for the past 6 months. Their relationship had unfolded like a flower blooming in spring, slow, natural, and beautiful. They'd taken their time, learning each other's rhythms, discovering shared dreams and comfortable silences. Clara had spent weekends at the ranch, helping Jake with the cattle, and falling in love with the wide-open spaces and endless sky. Jake had become a fixture in town, joining Clara for school events, and becoming an honorary member of the community he'd once only visited for supplies. "I have something for you," Jake said, his voice carrying a note of nervousness that made Clara turn in his arms. "It's not my birthday," she said, studying his face. "And Christmas is still 3 months away. I know, but I couldn't wait any longer." Jake stepped back and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box that made Clara's breath catch. He dropped to one knee right there in her kitchen, amid the smell of roasting meat and the warm glow of afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. "Clara Whitmore," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. 6 months ago, you were the bravest woman I'd ever seen, standing alone against a mob, with nothing but your dignity and your truth. Since then, you've become the strongest, kindest, most beautiful woman I've ever known. You've made me want to be a better man, a better partner, a better human being." Clara's hands flew to her mouth, tears already beginning to fall. "I love your laugh," Jake continued, opening the box to reveal a simple, elegant diamond ring. "I love the way you sing while you cook, the way you worry about your students, the way you cry at sad movies and pretend you don't. I love your courage, your compassion, your incredible ability to find joy even after everything you've been through." "Jake," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "I want to spend the rest of my life loving you," he said. "I want to build a future with you, raise children with you, grow old with you. Will you marry me?" Clara stared down at him, this man who'd appeared in her darkest hour and brought light back into her world. He was offering her everything she'd ever dreamed of, but had never dared to hope for. A love that was steady and true. A partnership built on mutual respect and shared dreams. A future filled with possibility. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." Jake slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that shook slightly, then rose to sweep her into his arms. He spun her around the kitchen, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. "I can't believe you proposed in my kitchen," Clara said, admiring the ring on her finger. "It was perfect, classic, and timeless, just like the man who'd chosen it." "I wanted to do it somewhere that felt like us," Jake said. "No fancy restaurant or dramatic sunset. Just us, in the place where we've shared so many quiet moments." Clara kissed him then, pouring all her love and gratitude and hope into the embrace. When they broke apart, she was breathless and giddy. When she asked, "When do you want to get married?" Jake's grin was pure joy. "Tomorrow, if you'd let me. But I suppose we should give you time to plan the wedding you've always dreamed of." "I don't need a big wedding," Clara said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I just need you. And maybe a few witnesses to make it official. Are you sure?" "Most women want." "I'm not most women," Clara interrupted, echoing his words from months ago. "And I've learned that the best things in life are the ones you don't plan for. The ones that find you when you least expect them." Jake's eyes darkened with emotion. "I love you, Clara Morrison Tooby." "I love you too, Jake Morrison Tooby." As they stood in her kitchen, holding each other close, Clara marveled at the journey that had brought them here. 6 months ago, she'd been a broken woman standing alone in a town square, facing the worst day of her life. Now she was engaged to the love of her life, preparing to start a new chapter filled with hope and happiness. Sometimes, she thought, the most beautiful stories begin with the darkest chapters. The little white church at the end of Main Street had never looked more beautiful. Clara stood in the small bridal room, adjusting her grandmother's pearl necklace and marveling at how perfectly everything had come together in just 2 weeks. She'd chosen a simple white dress, elegant but not elaborate, perfect for a small ceremony among friends and family. "You look radiant," Sarah Martinez said, fastening the last button on Clara's dress. The two women had become close friends in the months since Sarah's heartfelt apology. Their shared experience of crisis and forgiveness creating a bond that ran deeper than casual friendship. "I'm so nervous," Clara admitted, her hands trembling slightly. "What if I trip walking down the aisle? What if I forget my vows?" "You won't," Beth assured her, arranging Clara's simple bouquet of wildflowers and black-eyed Susans and baby's breath, all gathered from the fields around Jake's ranch. "You're going to be perfect." Through the window, Clara could see the small crowd gathering in the church. Jake had been right when he'd said she'd be surprised by how many people would want to make amends. The school board had insisted on paying for the flowers. The mayor had offered to perform the ceremony, and it seemed like half the town had volunteered to help with the reception. "It's time," Sarah said softly, handing Clara her bouquet. Clara took a deep breath and stepped into the church's small vestibule. Through the open doors, she could see Jake standing at the altar, looking handsome in his black suit and string tie. His face lit up when he saw her, and all her nervousness disappeared. The piano began to play, and Clara walked down the aisle, her eyes never leaving Jake's face. The church was full, but not crowded, filled with the people who mattered most. Her fellow teachers, Jake's ranch hands, neighbors who'd become friends, and even Mrs. Henderson, who'd approached Clara a month ago, with tears in her eyes and a request for forgiveness. "Dearly beloved," Mayor Johnson began, his voice carrying the weight of official ceremony. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Clara Whitmore and Jake Morrison in holy matrimony." The ceremony was simple and heartfelt. Clara's voice was steady as she recited her vows, promising to love Jake through good times and bad, through sickness and health, through all the challenges and joys that life might bring. Jake's voice was husky with emotion as he made the same promises, his eyes never leaving hers. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Mayor Johnson announced with a broad smile. "Jake, you may kiss your bride." Jake cupped Clara's face in his hands and kissed her softly, sweetly, while the congregation erupted in applause and cheers. Clara felt tears of joy streaming down her cheeks as she kissed her husband, for the first time as a married woman. The reception was held in the church's fellowship hall, decorated with more wildflowers and strings of lights that cast a warm glow over the celebration. Clara danced with Jake to their song, "At Last," by Etta James Wilde. Their friends and family looked on with smiles and tears of joy. "Any regrets?" Jake whispered in her ear as they swayed together. "Only that we didn't do this sooner," Clara replied, her heart full to overflowing. Later, as the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Clara found herself standing in the church parking lot with Jake, still wearing her wedding dress, but with her shoes in her hand and wildflowers in her hair. "Mrs. Morrison," Jake said, testing out her new name with a grin that made her heart flutter. "I like the sound of that," Clara replied, reaching up to straighten his tie. "Though I'm going to miss being Miss Clara to my students." "You'll always be Miss Clara to them," Jake said, pulling her close. "That's part of who you are, part of what makes you the incredible woman I fell in love with." Mrs. Henderson approached them hesitantly, her face etched with the permanent sadness that had marked her since Tommy's death, but also with something Clara had never seen before. "Peace. I wanted to thank you both," she said quietly, "for inviting me today, for showing me that forgiveness is possible, that healing can happen even after the worst tragedies." Clara embraced the older woman, feeling the weight of shared grief and mutual forgiveness. "Thank you for being here. Tommy would have wanted you to find happiness again." "I'm getting there," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice stronger than Clara had heard it in months. "Slowly, but I'm getting there." As they drove away from the church in Jake's truck, tin cans rattling behind them, and "Just Married" written in soap on the back window, Clara felt a profound sense of completion. The woman who'd stood alone in the town square 6 months ago was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more resilient, more open to love and possibility. "Where to, Mrs. Morrison?" Jake asked, his hand finding hers across the bench seat. "Home," Clara said, and for the first time in her life, she knew exactly where that was. The ranch house glowed with warm light as Jake carried Clara across the threshold, both of them laughing as he nearly tripped over the excited border collie who'd been guarding the house in their absence. "Down," Blue Jake commanded, though he was grinning. "Let me get my wife inside before you knock us both over." Clara loved the way he said "my wife," as if he couldn't quite believe it himself. The house had been transformed in their absence. Ranch hands had strung lights around the porch and filled the living room with more wildflowers. A bottle of champagne sat cooling on the kitchen counter, along with a note that read, "Welcome home, Boss and Mrs. Boss." "The boys there, going to be insufferable," Jake said, reading the note over Clara's shoulder. "I'll never hear the end of this. They love you," Clara said, turning in his arms. "They're happy for you." "They're happy for us," Jake corrected, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Clara, are you sure about this? About leaving your house in town? About starting over out here?" Clara looked around the house that was now her home. It was rustic and masculine, all leather and wood and stone, but she could already see how she'd make it theirs. Curtains for the windows, books on the shelves, her grandmother's china in the dining room. A home wasn't about the building. It was about the people who lived inside it. "I've never been more sure of anything," she said. "This is where I belong. With you." They spent their first night as husband and wife, talking and laughing and making plans for the future. Jake wanted to expand the herd, maybe add some horses. Clara wanted to start a garden, maybe teach riding lessons to the local children. They talked about the family they hoped to have, the life they wanted to build together. "I have a confession," Jake said as they lay in bed, Clara's head on his chest, his fingers running through her hair. "I've been driving past your house for almost a year, trying to work up the courage to introduce myself." "A year?" Clara lifted her head to look at him. "Why didn't you ever stop?" "Because I was scared," Jake admitted. "Scared you'd think I was just another cowboy with nothing to offer a woman like you. Scared you'd see right through me and find me lacking." Clara traced patterns on his chest with her finger. "Do you know what I see when I look at you? What I see: a man who stands up for what's right, even when it's hard. I see someone who's built something beautiful with his own hands, who cares for his animals and his land with patience and respect. I see a man who saved my life, not just from that mob, but from the loneliness and despair that was eating me alive." Jake caught her hand and brought it to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. "You saved me too, you know. I was so focused on building this ranch, on proving I could make something of myself, that I forgot to actually live. You taught me that success doesn't mean anything if you don't have someone to share it with." "We saved each other," Clara said, settling back against his chest. "That's what love is supposed to do." Outside, the night sounds of the ranch created a symphony that was quickly becoming familiar. The distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind through the grass, the call of night birds. It was so different from the quiet streets of town, but Clara found it oddly comforting. "No regrets?" Jake asked, echoing his question from the wedding dance. "None," Clara said firmly. "Well, maybe one." Jake tensed slightly. "What's that?" "I regret that it took a tragedy to bring us together," Clara said. "I wish we'd found each other under different circumstances." "I don't," Jake said, surprising her. "I wish Tommy Henderson was still alive. I wish you hadn't had to go through that hell, but I don't regret how we found each other. Maybe we needed to be broken before we could be whole together." Clara considered this, thinking about the woman she'd been before the accident, confident, perhaps, but also isolated, focused on her career and her quiet life to the exclusion of everything else. Would that woman have been ready for a love like this? Would she have been brave enough to embrace the unknown? "Maybe you're right," she said finally. "Maybe we both needed to learn what we were made of before we could truly appreciate what we'd found." As she drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, Clara felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them here. It had been painful and terrifying and wonderful, but it had led her to this moment, to this man, to this life she'd never dared to imagine. 1 year later, Clara stood in the same town square where her nightmare had begun, but this time she was surrounded by laughter and music instead of anger and hatred. The annual Harvest Festival was in full swing, and she was manning the school's booth, selling baked goods to raise money for new playground equipment. "Miss Clara?" Emma Patterson ran up to the booth, her face sticky with cotton candy and bright with excitement. "My mom made your famous chocolate chip cookies from the recipe you gave her. Did she now?" Clara laughed, leaning down to Emma's level. "And how did they turn out?" "Almost as good as yours," Emma said diplomatically, making Clara burst into laughter. "Mrs. Morrison, you're needed at the ring toss," Jake called from across the square, where he was helping set up games for the children. Clara's heart still skipped a beat when she heard her married name, especially when it came from Jake's lips. "I'll be right there," she called back, then turned to Sarah Martinez, who was helping her manage the booth. "Can you handle things here for a few minutes?" "Of course," Sarah said with a knowing smile. "Take your time." Clara made her way across the square, greeting friends and neighbors who'd become part of her extended family over the past year. Mrs. Henderson waved from the flower booth, where she was selling arrangements made from her prize-winning roses. The older woman had found her way back to life, slowly but surely, channeling her grief into something beautiful. "What do you need help with?" Clara asked Jake, slipping her arms around his waist from behind. "Actually," Jake said, turning in her arms, "I need help with something else entirely." Clara looked at him curiously, noting the nervous energy that reminded her of the night he'd proposed. "What kind of help?" Before Jake could answer, Mayor Johnson's voice boomed across the square from the makeshift stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for just a moment. The crowd began to quiet, conversations fading as people turned toward the stage. Clara felt Jake's hand take hers, warm and steady, and slightly trembling. This time last year, Mayor Johnson continued, our town was divided by anger and fear. We made terrible mistakes, hurt someone we should have protected, and nearly lost one of our most valuable citizens because we chose to believe the worst instead of seeking the truth. Clara felt her cheeks grow warm as she realized the speech was about her, about them. But today, I want to talk about redemption, about second chances, about the way love can heal even the deepest wounds. Clara and Jake Morrison, would you please join me on the stage? Clara's eyes widened in surprise, but Jake was already leading her forward, his grip on her hand reassuring and sure. They climbed the steps to the stage, and Clara found herself looking out at the same crowd that had once called for her destruction. Now they were smiling, applauding, welcoming her home. Clara, Mayor Johnson said, his voice carrying across the square. You taught us all a lesson about dignity, about grace under pressure, about the power of forgiveness. This town owes you a debt we can never fully repay. He handed her a plaque. That read, Clara Morrison, Citizen of the Year, for excellence in education and service to the community. Clara felt tears prick her eyes as she accepted the award, overwhelmed by the transformation in her life, in the town, in herself. But that's not the only presentation we have today, Mayor Johnson continued, stepping aside as Jake moved to the microphone. Clara, Jake said, his voice carrying that same nervous energy she'd noticed earlier. A year ago, you stood in this square and faced the worst day of your life. But you faced it with courage and dignity that inspired me to be brave enough to step forward, to speak the truth, to fight for what was right. Clara's heart began to race as she realized what was happening. You've given me the best year of my life, Jake continued, his eyes never leaving hers. You've made our house a home, our ranch a paradise, and me the luckiest man alive. But there's one more thing I want to give you, one more way I want to show you how much you mean to me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. But this time he didn't kneel. Instead, he opened it to reveal not a ring, but a small silver locket. This contains a deed, Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. A deed to 50 acres of the prettiest land on our ranch, with a creek running through it and a perfect spot for the house I want to build for you. Our house, Clara, the one we'll design together, the one where we'll raise our children, the one where we'll grow old together. Clara's hands flew to her mouth as she began to understand. Jake, what are you saying? I'm saying I want to build you a castle, princess, Jake said, using the endearment that had become his special name for her. I'm saying I want to give you everything you've ever dreamed of, and a few things you haven't even imagined yet. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause as Jake fastened the locket around Clara's neck. Clara threw her arms around him, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the love and acceptance surrounding them. I love you, she whispered in his ear. I love you so much, it scares me sometimes. Good, Jake whispered back. Because I plan to spend the rest of my life showing you exactly how much I love you too. As they stood together on the stage, surrounded by the cheers and applause of the community that had once rejected Clara, she marveled at the journey that had brought them here. She'd lost everything in this square a year ago, her reputation, her sense of security, her faith in human nature. But she'd also found everything that mattered: love, courage, the strength to forgive, and the wisdom to see that sometimes the darkest moments lead to the brightest futures. The cowboy who'd stood silent at her side in her darkest hour had become her husband, her partner, her greatest love. And the town that had tried to destroy her had become her home, her family, her greatest triumph. Sometimes, Clara thought, as Jake spun her around on the stage, while the crowd cheered, the best stories really do have fairy tale endings. You just have to be brave enough to believe in them. In the end, Clara Morrison learned that true strength isn't about standing alone. It's about having the courage to let others stand with you. And sometimes, the greatest love stories begin, not with a meet-cute, but with a man willing to stand in silence beside a woman who needs nothing more than to know she's not alone. Their love became legendary in Millbrook, a testament to the power of truth, the healing nature of forgiveness, and the beautiful reality that sometimes the worst day of your life can become the first day of your happily ever after.